Hello, I'm glad you could join us today. We're going to have some fun, we're going to visit, we're going to listen to some great music from some Hoosier musicians. We're going to learn about the West Baden Hotel from the ground up. So I'm going to go freshen my tea, and why don't you join us here on the porch? Neighbor Tom, I'm glad you could join me again today, and I saw you even tidying up my own porch. Now that's a neighbor.
Glad to help out.
Well, I'm going to bring my weed eater out the next time because I've got an area out back that I don't like to mess with. Well, you're such a good listener, and I don't know that I'm a good talker, but if you'll listen, I got another story for you. How's that?
Love a great story.
Well, I'll tell you, this has to do with politics, and has to do almost 30 years ago, almost 40 years ago, my lands. It's the summer of 1989. Evan Bayh was elected in 1988 as governor, youngest governor in the country, 33 years of age. Looked like he came out of central casting, you know, tall, lean, 6'1" or 2, not an ounce of fat on him, and this long kind of blonde brownish hair that parted in the middle. And we were over in Montgomery, Indiana. Now that's over in Daviess County, and they had Daviess and Martin County. Lagodi and Shoals and Washington, Indiana were coming together for a joint Jefferson-Jackson Day dinner. That's what we called Democrat gatherings back then. That's not politically correct anymore, so we don't call them that. But that's what we called them at the time. And these two counties had gone together to get enough people to have a JJ dinner, because there's not a lot of Democrats over there. And of course today, there's no Democrats in southern Indiana other than me. And so it's a pretty lonely job. But they've invited Evan down. And it's late summer, hotter than blue blazes out, and we're there at the Ruritan Club in downtown Montgomery, Indiana, and the place is packed. There's 400 or 500 people in there in their Sunday best, and they are dressed up and in these long tables. And all we're waiting on is for the governor to arrive, and it's time to start eating. No governor. Evan had a tendency to always run late because he liked to make an appearance, was my take on it. But I'm sitting there at the end of the first table with some other legislators from the area who've since gone on to their reward, as we would say. And we're sitting down there in a group, and all of a sudden the door opens. And standing there right out of central casting, larger than life, is a 33, 34-year-old Evan Bayh, lean and trim. He walks in, and the place just erupts in applause from 400 or 500 faithful Democrats. And Evan would always do his hair like this, you know, to kind of jostle. I can't do it because I don't have any hair. But he comes up there, and that first end of that table where the legislators were, he just was going to kind of blow by us and then start shaking hands with the rest of the guests. And he sees me, and he says, "Hey, John," and sticks his hand out, so I shake his hand. Well, sitting just catty corner of me were these two women. And I would have called them old women back then, but they're probably younger than what I am now, and they were just a yammering. I mean, they had yammered the whole time, and we had talked to them about them being at this political event, you know, where Governor Evan Bayh was going to come, and there were pictures of him and banners and all this stuff. Well, after he shakes my hand, he turns to these two women, puts his arms on both of their shoulders, and he said, "Ladies, I'm so glad you're here today." And they looked up at him, and they said, "Well, we're glad to be here." And he said, "Well, I know it's been time and effort to get here, and it's hot out, but you know, we're going to have a good time. We're going to have some good meals here, and we're just going to talk and visit." And they said, "Well, that's going to be great. That's going to be great." And he shakes both their hands, goes to the next people. And the one lady turns to the other and says, "My, he was a nice looking man, wasn't he?" And the one lady says, "Yes, he was. Who was he?" So I guess the moral of that story is no matter how important you might think you are or how everybody knows you, a lot of people don't, and they don't even care. George, I'm so glad you could join me here today on the porch. It's good to see a legend, not just a local boy makes good from Carlisle, Indiana, but just glad that I know just down the road at both of our alma maters at VU, you're now on the board.
Yep.
And what had you done before you were on the board at VU many years ago as a young man?
I taught architecture and land surveying here for about 14 years.
Did you enjoy it?
I did. I had a great time.
Good, good. Now, what's it like being a trustee now?
It's very interesting, sometimes challenging. There's always something that's going on, not just at board meetings, but throughout the year.
Yeah. And I think you and I were even members of the same college fraternity, only not at the same time. We're both Sigma Pi's.
That's true.
I thought that. Now, Alpha chapter. So, well, that's great. Well, you know, I knew you because when you used to have your office in Vincennes,
Right.
and then up at Westphalia, you drew the plans for my home. But just before that time, you started getting involved with Mr. Bill Cook of the Cook Group, Bill and Gail,
Yep.
up at Bloomington. So you are technically and are the architect of the remodeling, redoing, renovation of both French Lick and the West Baden hotels.
Yep, I am.
Now, when did that start? How did it come about you get hooked up with Bill?
Well, I had a student, and I was teaching a night class that was from 4 to 7, and his father had passed away and left him a steel fabricating business in Bedford. And I had taught him how to fabricate steel, and he furnished all the steel for the Cook projects at the time.
Oh my.
And his name was Brian Slinkard, and Brian called me one day and said that Mr. Cook, his architect, was retiring. He was looking for a new one, and I should call him. And after a week or so, I called him, and so, you know, it came about through a student, and we spent a couple hours in an interview, and Mr. Cook never asked me if I had a license to be an architect, never asked me anything about any project I'd ever done. We talked about singing barbershop music, we talked about trees, we talked about anything other than architecture. I found out a year or two later that he already knew everything about me. And the last thing he said to me the day of the interview was, well, I can use you. And I said, when do you want me to start? And he said, well, right now. We should have already been working. And I said, well, Mr. Cook, we just wasted 2 hours of daylight. And I started to work that day, the 6th of June, 1987.
Wow. Now, when did your involvement down at West Baden and French Lick start?
May the 6th of 96.
So you had 9 years before you became an Orange Countian by adoption.
Yeah.
Well, tell me about your first day and how that went down there.
The first day, Historic Landmarks owned the building, and we were down there. The Cook Group was going to fund restoration of all the public spaces, the big domed atrium, the lobby, the dining room, and so people could see the building. 104 feet of the exterior perimeter, all 6 floors had collapsed in 91, and Bill and Steve Ferguson was there and several other dignitaries, and Mr. Cook and I were standing outside and looking at that big collapse and all the rubble. And there were all kinds of stories, and Mr. Cook had heard them all, of how an ice dam had occurred on the roof, or it was weak concrete, or the brick masonry had collapsed. And he looked at me and he said, George, you're the architect. Tell me what really made it happen. And I was quiet for a minute, and I said, well, Bill, gravity be my guess. And
Well, you were right.
yeah, it was gravity. Yeah.
So I remember, because I was in the legislature, seeing that
Right.
whole back end, how it had fallen. I never thought from when I first saw those hotels in the early 60s, and of course French Lick then was the Sheraton, but I never thought I would see West Baden or French Lick look anything like they do today. And if you've not been there,
Yep.
you're missing something.
That's
Now,
true.
if you go down there, you can take a tour. You don't have to be a gambler, do you?
Nope, you don't have to. Yep, you can stay in the hotel. There's all kinds of amenities and golf courses and horseback riding and skeet shooting now.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of things besides gambling.
Well, even though I've been down there with you and had you given me a tour and other people, their tours that they give through volunteers are just great.
They're very good.
And really enjoy them. Well, I know when you started down there, You had to save the building. What did the plans tell you about the facility?
There were no plans. We spent several months measuring both hotels just to know what the conditions were that we had to deal with.
Well, George, I can't imagine all of the challenges. But what was one of the most bizarre things you ran into? There had to be something just weird.
There was. And it was on the 3rd floor of the West Baden Hotel. It was a very large area that Lee Sinclair, the builder of the original West Baden Hotel, that's where he lived, and it was his suite. And for some reason, there was a column, a concrete column, that held up the roof, and the roof was all concrete.
That big dome's concrete.
No. This was one of the areas off to the side of the
Okay,
dome.
okay.
Yeah.
I know where you mean.
And it was a flat roof, and that part was concrete. But evidently, Lee Sinclair wanted that column gone. And it was a big column. It was 2 foot square concrete. Because when we go through there, there's no column. There is on the other side of the hotel, but not on this side. And there's a steel beam running across and a very large log chain wrapped around it that goes up through the roof and off through the 5th floor wall. And evidently he had wanted that column removed for some unknown reason. And we decided that we probably best ought to put it back. So we put the column back, and I told Mr. Cook at the time that now we can take the chain down. He said, no, George, leave the chain. That's all part of the show.
Oh, wow. That's amazing thing. I guess if you own the hotel like Mr. Sinclair did back then, you could
do what you want.
Dang well want. Well, I remember years ago you telling me, those, I'm going to call them belfries or towers.
Towers.
You told me about reinstalling them. Tell me that story. I'd love to hear that again.
Yeah, the towers were built in Campbellsville, Kentucky, and trucked to the site. And we had investigated how big a crane it would take to set that. And there was one crane in Dallas, Texas, and it would cost right at $500,000 to bring the crane to India.
That's real money.
That's real money. And then we started investigating helicopters, and there was a company, Erickson Air Crane, out of Portland, Oregon, and they brought in a sky crane. The name on the side of it was Big Bubba, and it was. The helicopter would burn 636 gallons of fuel every hour.
Oh my.
And these 4 towers were 20 foot square and almost 40 some feet tall. It weighed 19,333 pounds. Helicopter could only lift 20,000.
So those towers are 10 ton.
Yeah.
Yeah, 10 ton.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's when they're clean. So from the time the helicopter started on the ground, lifted off the ground, got over top of the tower, hooked it up, raised it, took it over to the hotel, set it on the site, unhooked, and came back and landed. It all had to happen in 8 minutes because that's all the fuel it could put on board.
Wow.
And we put 4 towers on, and everything went like clockwork.
So I assume you had that rehearsed and scripted down to the second. I mean, it wasn't like somebody fighting over who was going to do what.
No, we had everything choreographed, and we had even named the 4 towers because we needed a lot more luck. And they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Well, a good name. I want to tell some of our listeners now, those aren't the Beatles. Those are the four Gospels, the first 4 books of the New Testament. Well, that is a great story. Great story to tell. I want to go back to telling people to visit down there. We make it a point. Lisa and I go down there 4 or 5 times a year and stay. Yeah. We love staying at West Baden. That's where we normally stay. But every time we have out-of-state guests or Hoosier guest. I know when you would have been at VU, you'd have remembered Dr. Chelsea Lawless.
Oh, yes.
When his son Philip, who lives in Pennsylvania, came back, he wanted to see the French Lick and West Baden Hotel. Now, you mentioned the figure of $14 million early on.
Yeah.
Can I ask how much, when you consider the golf course, the old golf course, the new golf course, everything else, the Cook Group spent on that thing?
Including the casino and the convention center, the parking garage, and restoration of the 2 hotels, it was right at $525 million.
$500 million.
Today we're at 645.
Well, I know that can't be a huge rate of return business, but every time I see Steve Ferguson, and I want to say the same thing to you, thank you. I know Bill's gone, but to the Cook Group, and of course to their son still involved, that is just a testimony to Indiana greatness. I mean, that is truly a landmark. What's your favorite room, thing, item on that property?
Oh, it's got to be the big atrium at West Baden.
Yeah.
Every time you walk in there, it's just a wow. It never ceases to amaze me.
We walk in like we are just in from the farm,
Right.
and look up. That big fireplace there, I have to tell you, that if somebody asked me my second favorite, that big fireplace in the atrium is just gorgeous with that little sprudel.
Yep.
The little West Baden sprudel, the little gnome-like creature sitting up there. That's just beautiful.
And that fireplace is all rookwood pottery.
Really?
If you ever watch the antique show,
Yeah.
there'll be an appraiser take a vase and say it's $10,000 or $12,000, and I'd like to have that appraiser down at West Baden and show him that fireplace that's 25 feet long and 12 feet high, and maybe that vase would just be a vase.
Well, that's good. Well, I appreciate you stopping by and visiting with us today. I want you to sit tight. I know you're going to do some other visiting while you're here in the area again today, but I want you to sit here. We're going to have a great musician and just listen to some good Hoosier music.
Sounds good.
Well, another near neighbor stops by with the Indiana Arts Commission, Maya Michelson. Maya, who we got playing for us today?
John, I am tickled to say today we have on the front porch Kara Barnard from Nashville, fantastic musician and instructor. So Kara, if you play one for us.
I would love to, Maya. Thank you. You got to set the mood. I was standing by my window on a cold and cloudy day when I saw that hearse come rolling for to carry my mother away. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. Well, I followed close behind her. I tried to hold up and be brave, but I could not hide my sorrow when they laid her in her grave. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting E10 in the sky, Lord, in the sky. I was singing with my sisters. I was singing with John and all of his friends on the front porch. And we all can sing together, 'cause the circle never ends. Will the circle be unbroken by and by, Lord, by and by? There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky. There's a better home awaiting in the sky, Lord, in the sky.
Thanks so much for being here. And I know that in addition to teaching, you also do some volunteer ministry type work with older adults.
Well, I tell you what, John, I've developed this curriculum for folks that are in assisted living facilities and older adults, because the dulcimer is actually a pretty simple instrument to play. Now, you can do very difficult things on it, or you can do very simple things on it. And so I like to go in, and instead of entertaining them by playing for them, I make them the musicians.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is really great.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you to my friend George and Maya for being here today. And I'll tell you, life is pretty tough. You know, we live in an imperfect world. And so this next week, if you see somebody looks like they're having a tough time, give them a smile. Maybe the only one they get. Play us out.
Will do. Thank you very much.
You got a story, I'd like to hear it. Morning glories, boats on the river. Sit a spell, sing a tune to yourself, and I'll join you on the porch. On the porch means everything to come home, spinning with a vein.